Thank you for that introduction. Let me get started. My plan for tonight is to provide you with a broad picture of LGBTQ activism from its start in the 1950s until the early 21st century. And I want to start with what I describe as the worst time to be queer, the 1950s and 1960s in the US. Oppression is really out there. It's undisguised, it's aggressive, it shows itself in many different ways. For instance, a US Senate committee in 1950 issued a report titled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government. One memorable line from the report was, "One homosexual can pollute an entire government office." When Eisenhower became president in 1953, he almost immediately issued an executive order that banned the employment of all LGBTQ people from federal government jobs and also with government contractors, so in the entire defense industry, for instance. The military engaged in witch hunts, discharging, at least a couple of thousand people a year on LGBTQ charges. The FBI engages in intense surveillance of what it described as sex offenders and sex perverts. It accumulated over 300,000 pages of documentation about queer lives. Homosexual behavior is a crime in every state. Um, Two men, for instance, holding hands in a gay bar could be arrested on charges of disorderly conduct. Many states and cities have laws against what was called cross-dressing. In other words, wearing gender non-conforming clothing. So a female, for instance, could be arrested for wearing pants that had a zipper in the front. Um, Headlines from the Chicago Tribune capture what these years were like. Uh, Here it's covering the Senate investigation, and it's writing about moral misfits and sex perverts in the federal government. Bar raids were very common by the police, and it also made headlines. Files against 87, 24 in a war on degenerates, and this happens very, very frequently. So, under these circumstances, as you might imagine, people lived in the closet. The phrase that was used in these years was wearing a mask. They pretend people, LGBTQ people pretended in their lives to their family, their neighbors, friends, and the workplace to be heterosexual or gender conforming. Uh, Occasionally, someone will become visible, but it's usually against their will and as an attack upon them. Uh, One example, for instance, is Bayard Rustin, uh, most famous for being the organizer of the iconic 1963 March on Washington. Well, a couple of weeks before that march, a segregationist senator from South Carolina reveals in the Senate that the organizer of the march was a sex pervert. In other words, he was gay. And the senator got that information from the FBI. Well, Rustin survives. The civil rights movement backs him, but it's a good example of the vulnerability that LGBTQ people faced. Um, During these years, in terms of public culture, there are no LGBTQ characters in television series, for instance. The most visible representation of queer life in these years were so-called lesbian pulp novels. They were widely available. They were sold in drugstores and on newsstands everywhere. And they were scandalous and negative in their portrayal. The covers are offensive, and I'm about to show you two of them, but they capture the times. Um, Here's one: warped, twisted passions in the twilight world, or degraded women. And as I say, many, many of these were written over the years. So, under these circumstances, how do LGBTQ people start to resist? In response to the intensity of oppression, a continuous history of activism and organizing finally starts around 1950. Uh, the Mattachine Society formed in Los Angeles around 1950. One Incorporated, which published a monthly magazine, also and was an offshoot of Mattachine. The Daughters of Bilitis, a lesbian organization, was founded in San Francisco in the mid 1950s. These organizations hold meetings. They have public lectures in which liberal ministers or doctors or lawyers are the invited speakers. They publish magazines. Mattachine and the Daughters established chapters in a few cities in the 50s and 60s. Chicago had chapters on and off. Um, but given the times, it was a very cautious kind of activism. I mean, for example, just look at the names of these organizations. Would you have any idea if you heard about them that they were LGBTQ organizations? Uh, Members often use pseudonyms so as not to expose themselves. The organizations try to take a reasonable and responsible approach. They're not in any way militant. But for the people who find them, they're also, and it's a relatively small number, but they're also life-saving organizations. People subscribe to their magazines, receive them in the mail in unmarked envelopes without a return address. Uh, Now, during these years, while this is happening, uh, a small number of individuals do push the envelope a bit during these years. Uh, Christine Jorgensen, for instance, is the first American to have what in those years was called sex change surgery. Now it's described as gender affirmation surgery in 1952. It was a headline in newspapers across the country. And throughout the 50s and 60s, she tries to maintain a visible presence so that others can use her as a model for what's possible for them. Um, in Chicago, Valerie Taylor was a novelist in the 50s and 60s who used that lesbian pulp form to write more positive novels about lesbians that were also sold widely. So hers have titles like Whisper Their Love, The Girls in 3B, A World Without Men. Jose Saria was a drag performer in not Chicago, San Francisco's gay bars. And in response to police raids that had become very intense at the end of the 50s, in 1961, he runs for city supervisor in San Francisco. It's the first time an out of the closet LGBTQ person ran for public office. He doesn't get elected, but it was a powerful symbol for queer people in San Francisco. Now, by the mid 60s, some of these groups are becoming more visible and assertive. The civil rights movement was making collective protest and demands for equality more commonplace. In Washington, D.C., a man named Frank Kameny, uh, he was an astronomer working for the federal government in the 50s who was fired when the FBI reported that he was gay. Uh, and he forms a chapter of the Mattachine Society and tries to challenge the government ban on employment and helps organize the first public LGBTQ demonstrations. I'll show you a couple of images, and you can see just from looking at it how, or it's a big deal, but how orderly these demonstrations look. Um, Now, in 1968, they moved at a conference held in Chicago where activists from around the country came together. They adopted the slogan, "Gay is good." Um, and by the second half of the 60s, the upheavals of the decade are reaching further into the queer community. Um, Chicago Mattachine activists, for instance, begin using the phrase gay power in the late 60s, building off of Black power from the militant African American struggle. And with things like this, these new perspectives and some public demonstrations starting to happen, in late June of 1969, when the police in New York City raid a Greenwich Village bar called the Stonewall Inn, the patrons of the bar fought back, and several nights of rioting ensued. And Stonewall becomes the symbolic marker of a major historical turning point, the birth of what gets described at the time as a gay liberation movement. And already by the following spring, there's enough of this new militant, angry activism by a younger generation influenced by the 1960s that activists in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago all have a march and rally to commemorate the Stonewall Rebellion. And of course now pride marches and parades are held all around the globe every June. 500,000 people come out in Chicago to watch the parade. And I'll show you some images of those early marches, which look so different from those first protest photos I showed you. Gay Liberation Day, this is in New York in 1970. All power to Butch Bull Dykes. Gay power, Black power, women power, student power. Um, and a key element I should point out of this new militant gay liberation movement was the call to come out of the closet, to reject shame and secrecy, reject pretending to be someone you're not, and declare yourself. Make yourself visible to everyone. This is an early gay liberation magazine. So, what changes in the 1970s with this new kind of militant activism? The first big development is an explosion of organizations. At the time of Stonewall, after almost 20 years of activism, there were maybe 50 LGBTQ organizations in the US in 1969. By 1974, there are between 800 and 1,000. Some last, some come and go quickly, but they bring people together around a wide range of missions. You have local all-purpose organizations. You have religious organizations like Dignity for Gay Catholics or Integrity for Episcopalians. LGBTQ synagogues start to come together. There are cultural organizations, groups of singers, theater troupes, music festivals, health and social service organizations. In Chicago, Howard Brown gets started in the 70s and it still exists today. Horizons gets started as a community center and it has become the center on Halsted. There are national organizations like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, Lambda Legal, which deals with court cases. So besides organizations, a second development is cultural representation. Building a queer press so that you're no longer dependent on what the Tribune says. And these magazines are way out there. Like here's one, Lesbian Tide or Fag Rag, a gay male newspaper. These some people also form small presses to publish LGBTQ books at a time when most publishers wouldn't do that. So Ruby Fruit Jungle was published by a feminist press in 1973. It's a lesbian novel that's probably become the most widely read lesbian novel ever written. A third sign of change in the 1970s is winning allies. Organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Bar Association, the National Council of Churches, the American Psychological Association, all come out and endorse repeal of criminalizing laws and passage of anti-discrimination. And I should point out that at this point, all of the gains that are being made are around issues of sexual orientation. Gender identity isn't yet asserting itself with the same level of collective action in the 70s, even though some of the individual activists are what we would describe as transgender, and they form a few organizations. Another development in the 70s is that there are some real victories. I'll just mention some of them in this list. The American Psychiatric Association in 1973 eliminates homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. Some states start to repeal their sodomy laws. Illinois is the first one to do it. At the 1976 Democratic National Convention, there are some openly LGBTQ delegates to the convention. The first members of the military begin to openly challenge the ban on their participation. And perhaps most importantly of all, in the 70s, in some larger cities, there's a real decline in police harassment, especially bar raids. And this is important because it leads to a more visible urban nightlife that helps build community. So, in comparison to how things were before, the change in the 70s is very significant, but it's also uneven. And in comparison to how things are now in 2025, they're also very limited. What doesn't change? People, the overwhelming majority, are still living in the closet. They have not come out, and they're not activists. It's an internally divided population, reflecting the divisions in the society in gender, race, class, that gets reflected in organizations. So that, for instance, after Stonewall, there's a gay liberation front, but very soon women leave it and form organizations like Radical Lesbians. People of color form organizations like Third World Gay Revolution. Trans folks leave the general organizations and create their own. Like in Chicago, there was a transvestite legal committee. And then there's a whole movement within a movement that was described as lesbian feminist separatism, where because the women's movement was seen as too homophobic and the gay movement was seen as too sexist. And so lesbians form their own separate organizations. And these divisions, this internal division that I'm describing, it's reflected in community institutions. For instance, gay bars in many places in the 1970s demanded that men and women of color provide them with 2 or 3 forms of identification before being let into the bar. So racial discrimination within the community was very real. Now, meanwhile, even as this activism is forming, as is growing, it's also spawns an organized counterattack, what I describe here as intense homophobia. And 1977 saw the first high-profile targeting of the gay and lesbian movement. Dade County, Miami, in Florida, had passed a sexual orientation non-discrimination law at the beginning of 1977. And at that point, a person named Anita Bryant, who was a former beauty pageant contestant, a popular singer, she was a spokesperson for the Florida citrus industry, becomes the leading person in a campaign to repeal that non-discrimination law through a voter referendum. And in June of 1977, 2/3 of voters vote to repeal the non-discrimination. Bryant begins traveling around the country, to get other places to repeal their laws. She calls her campaign Save Our Children from Homosexuality. And she's successful in a few cities. The biggest of all these initiatives occurred statewide in California, where there was a ballot initiative in 1978, Proposition 6, or the Briggs Initiative, that would have required the firing of any school employee known to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or any school employee who spoke favorably about homosexuality. Now, fortunately, Proposition 6 was defeated. And it's also true that Anita Bryant, by giving such vocal visibility to homophobia, had the effect of bringing more people out of the closet and increasing the ranks of activists. Pride marches in June of 77 were noticeably bigger than they had been in earlier years. This is California. In 1977, Bryant appeared in Chicago at the Medina Temple, and it provoked the largest LGBT demonstration here. That's outside the temple that Chicago had seen yet. One of the activists there was interviewed by a journalist, and the quotation that appeared in the newspaper from her was, "Every kick is a boost." In other words, sometimes political enemies can actually prove helpful. So by the end of the 70s, the beginnings of the society we live in now are taking shape. There's visibility, there are organizations, community, political activism, a first set of victories, but we're still in the early stages of change. And as the 80s begin, things are not looking so good. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 gave the conservative Christian evangelical right a voice in national politics. It was part of the coalition that elected Reagan. And just as a new wave of conservative attacks is taking off, something new enters the picture, and that is the AIDS epidemic. And as we'll see, AIDS changes everything. Some of it obviously for the worse, but as it will turn out, some of it for the better as well. AIDS was new, scary, uncontrollable at first. The first cases are reported in medical journals in June of 1981 and in the national press the following month. Groups of young men in LA, New York, and San Francisco were developing a rare kind of cancer and pneumonia, and their immune systems had mysteriously lost the ability to fight infection. The common factor reported in these cases was that the men were homosexuals. And initially, the condition is labeled GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. The media talks about it as a gay cancer. The common factor that gets reported over and over again is that these are homosexuals. And it rapidly became clear that people of color were being disproportionately affected as well. The media talked about risk groups rather than a risk factor. So they're really stereotyping and labeling people. And the number of deaths explodes. 1981, at the end of 81, the total number of deaths in the US was 166. By 1992, it had reached to almost 200,000, and most people are dying within a year of diagnosis. Initially, in the first few years, there's very little press coverage, but then in 1985, Rock Hudson is reported to have AIDS. Here he is on the cover of Newsweek. Hudson was a Hollywood icon of the 50s and 60s. He gets AIDS, he dies. Suddenly, though, the media is starting to say, well, if Rock Hudson can get AIDS, anybody can. And it's all because of those homosexuals. There's panic and hysteria. There are proposals to quarantine people, uh, to tattoo people with AIDS so that everybody will recognize them. People are evicted from housing. They're denied care in hospitals. There's seclusion and isolation. Congress amends its budget proposal in the early 1980s so that no federal funds can be used to promote homosexuality. Well, how then do you engage in AIDS prevention education if you can't make any reference to homosexuality? There's no government positive response for several years, but AIDS mobilizes the LGBTQ community like never before. Uh, the first response I would describe as local self-help. Uh, Local community health organizations are formed. Earlier, I talked about lesbian feminist separatism. Well, lesbians get deeply involved in working within the community to support and help people with AIDS. There's also political organizing at the city and county level, pushing for money and service delivery and public health agencies to be supportive. Um, AIDS is identified in 1984 as HIV as the cause of it. Uh, and suddenly there are local education efforts about reduction, like condom use and no sharing of needles for among drug users. Um, and just as all this is happening, the tragedy of AIDS and the organizing by the community, in 1986, the Supreme Court issues a decision in Bowers versus Hardwick, declaring that state laws that criminalize homosexual sex, what were called sodomy laws, are constitutional. And the language of the decision was horrible. Uh, no such thing as a fundamental right to commit homosexual sodomy. To declare these laws unconstitutional would be to cast aside millennia of moral teaching. One of the justices described the whole challenge to these laws as facetious. Well, as you can imagine, you combine this with the AIDS crisis, and the impact on activism is impressive. Uh, and one dramatic example of change. In 1979, on the 10th anniversary, for the 10th year of Stonewall, activists held their first march on Washington for the LGBTQ movement. Maybe 100,000 people showed up nationwide. 1987, the year after Hardwick and into the AIDS epidemic, when there's a march, 500,000 people show up. So clearly, AIDS is going well beyond, by the second half of the 80s, generating local response. It's mobilizing the population as never before. And a big moment comes in 1987 with the beginning of direct action groups in a number of cities. And lots of activists deserve credit for this shift, but I want to highlight one in particular because of his high media profile, Larry Kramer. He was a Hollywood screenwriter. Uh, he wrote a high profile novel in the 70s that he named Faggots, but was a very gay positive novel. He writes an essay about AIDS very early, 1,112 and counting. That's the number of deaths at that point, in which he basically says, we're going to all die unless we get angry and do something. Uh, he writes a play called The Normal Heart about AIDS, which is first produced in New York City, but then productions of it occur all around the country. And then in 1987, he gives a speech at the New York City LGBTQ Community Center, which was a call to arms. And out of it comes the direct action group ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And one of the things about ACT UP is that although it starts in New York, very soon groups ACT UP groups form all over the country, and not just like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, but Shreveport, Louisiana, and Tulsa, Oklahoma had ACT UP organizations. They engage in powerful demonstrations around the country. They disrupt the New York Stock Exchange. They hold a die-in in Daley Plaza during a weekday workday. They block the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco during rush hour, invade the Food and Drug Administration in Maryland to pressure the government to speed up drug testing. They conduct what they describe as a Stop the Church demonstration in New York City, where they interrupt a mass being said by the Catholic cardinal at the main Catholic cathedral in New York. And these actions get lots of media coverage. Well, to give you some example of the spirit and outlook of these demonstrations and the posters that they create, I'm going to just show you some images of demonstrators, and you can sense the anger and the militancy. Silence equals death, their t-shirts. Stop the church. This was a big demonstration in New York City. This is one in Chicago, a demonstration against the Catholic cardinal in Chicago. Uh, the posters, silence equals death. Know your scumbags. They're not being nice. Ronald Reagan, he kills me. One AIDS death every half hour. And, I mean, these are general examples, but in Chicago, a really important member of ACT UP was this figure here, Danny Sotomayor, who was also a political cartoonist who began to do cartoons about AIDS that got printed in LGBTQ publications around the country. Here is one here where he's picturing Jesse Helms, the conservative Republican from North Carolina, who's saying 6 million dead from AIDS. And there's Adolf Hitler saying, sounds like a good number to me. So, it's quite militant what's going on in ACT UP. Um, at the same time, another powerful response of a different sort is appearing, the Names Project Memorial Quilt, which gets started in San Francisco in 1987. People are encouraged to make quilt panels to honor the memory of those who died. It's first publicly shown at that 1987 march in Washington that I mentioned. It's spread out on the Washington Mall, hundreds of these panels. And then it travels around the country. In 1988, there was a weekend-long exhibition, big exhibition of it on Navy Pier, and tens of thousands of people from the Chicago area went to see it. And the quilt is, it's not protest, but it has the effect of making the price of AIDS and lives lost very real and powerful. And I'll display this with some of the visuals. Gregorio Ramirez, the Mexican flag. David Thompson, who went to Columbia and Stanford. A cellist. This one is made by the daughter of someone who died of AIDS. This one made by a neighbor of someone who died of AIDS, in which in the panel she's kind of written a letter of love coming out to him as the lesbian that she is. This one to Roger Gale Lyon. He was one of the first AIDS people with AIDS to come out and speak openly in Washington, D.C. about what he was going through. So you can see, there's anger, there's protest. And by the early 1990s, this is starting to make a big difference in the movement as a whole. The LGBT community is beginning to work as part of a national coalition that includes professional associations of nurses, doctors, social work, public health workers to get funding for research, treatment, and protection. They work at the state and local level, but also at the national level and get some victories. The Ryan White Care Act in 1990 is a huge federal AIDS funding bill and mechanism that provides money to local organizations around the country. The Americans with Disabilities Act uh, is a civil rights act to protect people with disabilities from discrimination. Positive HIV status is listed as a form of disability and therefore protection from discrimination. The Hate Crime Statistics Act was passed by Congress. The federal government began collecting data on hate crimes, and sexual orientation is one of the categories of people that are listed for collecting data. And in 1992, as a marker of change, the, the first presidential candidate, Bill Clinton, it's the first time a presidential candidate actively seeks out the support of the LGBTQ community and speaks out on community issues and to members of the community. Now, I said earlier, AIDS changes everything. Uh, some examples of what I mean. Lots of people come out, far more than in the 1970s. I mean, it's growing exponentially as the disease spreads from big cities and university towns to practically everywhere. Uh, Now coming out feels like a matter of life and death. How can I not come out? And the 1987 March was another catalyst. 500,000 people go to it, and it changes them forever. Uh, Also, all these organizations that exist that had been based entirely on volunteer labor, well, now they're able to raise enough money and have large enough budget that they can have paid staff. And that makes a really big difference. And initially, that's for AIDS service organizations, but soon AIDS donors become LGBTQ donors. And organizations like Lambda Legal and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force all grow significantly between the early 80s and the early 90s. They also, many mainstream alliances are formed. Um, I mentioned earlier, like nurses, doctors, social workers, but also boards of education, human resource personnel, and corporations. And initially, those connections are about fighting AIDS, but it opens the door to talking more broadly about sexual orientation. And it's no accident that New York City in 1986 and Chicago in 1988 finally passed non-discrimination laws based on sexual orientation. And then one other thing that I'll mention here is that it's much greater involvement in traditional electoral politics. People need to lobby around AIDS issues. They develop ties with congressional and legislative staff, learn how the system works. More people from the community run for public office. And the change doesn't stop here. Uh, because of AIDS, there's a much heightened level of organizing and visibility among LGBTQ people of color. Uh, Organizations like YEGO, the Latino, Latina, Lesbian, and Gay Organization, the National Black, Lesbian, and Gay Leadership Forum, a minority AIDS project forms in Los Angeles that becomes a model for activists and communities around the country. They also create a national minority AIDS coalition. In Chicago, as an example, every year there's a large Bud Billiken parade on the South Side in the African American community. In 1993, for the first time, there's an LGBTQ contingent in it. In Chicago in 1995, a group called Amigas Latinas forms. And it's a lesbian, women loving women organization. It becomes one of the most important activist organizations in Chicago over the next 20 years. Uh, and, I mean, really, the AIDS funding, paradoxically, is what helps make this possible because AIDS organizations are formed almost entirely of LGBTQ people, and they work on both AIDS issues and queer issues. Another form of change, uh, much more visibility and organizing among bisexual and trans people. Uh, AIDS led to the targeting of bisexuals. The media presents them as being responsible for spreading the gay disease to the rest of the population. Uh, Bisexual organizing really takes off by the 90s. BiNet is forms in 1990 and it's a national network. The 1993 March on Washington is called a March for Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Rights. Uh, AIDS also helped to expose the marginalization of the transgender population. Trans women were highly at risk for a variety of reasons, but the larger community wasn't responding to them so that they begin organizing. A series of books in the 90s come out by transgender authors, Leslie Feinberg, uh, Kate Bornstein, and others. And by the mid 90s, LGBT starts being used in many settings. Um, so, that's the visibility that we're seeing today really took off in that decade. Another significant change is a much more visible presence in popular culture. Remember, once upon a time, there were lesbian pulp novels. Well, in 1993, 94, Tom Hanks is in a movie, Philadelphia, as a man with AIDS. Tony Kushner writes a play that premieres on Broadway, Angels in America, about the AIDS epidemic. And it wins awards and again is performed all around the country. Um, MTV's The Real World, one of the first reality TV shows, has Pedro Zamora on it. He was the first out gay man on MTV's show, The Real World, and it broke TV barriers. Uh, and then, some of you may remember this in 1996, 97, the Ellen TV series. The whole season is structured around her tiny step by tiny step coming out of the closet. Uh, and finally, she does. And again, it's like national headlines. There's also much more involvement in national politics. The gays in the military debate of 1993. Uh, Congress passes Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which eliminates the formal ban as long as you remain in the closet. In 1993, Hawaii legalizes same-sex marriage. Congress passes a Defense of Marriage Act in 1996 to say that in terms of federal benefits, we only recognize marriage between a man and a woman. There are state ballot measures around the country to formally make the whole concept illegal in state constitutions. And then so as you can see just from these three examples, sometimes being involved in national politics is not exactly the best thing, that it can involve defeats in this period. But in 2003, the Supreme Court issues a decision in the Lawrence versus Texas case, which overturns that earlier case that I mentioned, Bowers v. Hardwick, and decriminalizes homosexual behavior. And this is a really significant marker of change. Criminality is no longer the starting point anywhere in the United States. So I'm basically going to stop here. There's a lot that could be said about the last 20 years, marriage equality and the Obergefell Hodges case in 2015, which made it legal nationally. The growth of gay straight alliances and queer straight alliances in middle schools and high schools around the country, a dramatic increase in transgender visibility and battles over gender identity, and a very big victory in 2020, which most people probably are not aware of. But in a Supreme Court decision of Bostock versus the Clayton Act, it said that the 1964 Civil Rights Act does, in fact, cover discrimination based on sexual orientation. So obviously, there are many things that I haven't talked about for the last 20 years, but if I did that, it would keep you here all night. We're living in an interesting time right now in which many so-called red states are passing anti-LGBTQ laws, especially around trans issues and the schools, and a president who seems to be supporting that. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of response is built around that in response to that over the next couple of years. I'll mention two final things. If you're interested in exploring more LGBTQ history online, we have an organization in Chicago called the Gerberhardt Library and Archives, which is an LGBTQ historical society. It's in Rogers Park. And if you go to their website, there's a lot of information in there on there about queer history. And to promote a book of my own, one of my most recent books is called Queer Legacies, Stories from Chicago's LGBTQ Archives. And it's a series of short chapters focused on Chicago with about different kinds of examples of activism, sometimes an individual or an issue or an organization. So, as I said, let me stop here. Thanks very much. And Nathan, do you want to see if there are any questions and let me know, or any comments, which I'm happy to listen to and also to respond to?